Meeting is being live streamed. Meeting is being live streamed.
Yeah.
I like this better when it was being recorded, recording in progress.
Okay, great. So last week, I can't remember exactly what we were talking about because I mean, who does? But I assigned the reading from Infinity, which is on page 137, all the way to the end of the chapter on determinate being, just to 156. And I mean, even if you just got to transition and didn't read the remarks, you basically got to the end of it anyway. So this takes us from talking about infinity, where being finitude turns over into infinity, to uh, crap. Um, Basically to the transition into being for self. But right before the transition, you get to affirmative infinity. Um, yeah, and that's how far we got. And so, um, so anyway, just to lead off, where we started was basically defining the infinite. In Hegel's terms, the infinite is A, in its simple determination, affirmative as negation of the finite. Duh. But then, thus, it is in alternating determination with the finite and is the abstract one-sided infinite. And then C, the self-sublation of this infinite and of the finite as a single process. This is the true or genuine infinite. Okay. So what's going on here is there's a double oscillation. You remember the oscillation from being to nothing that occurred at the very, very beginning of the logic, and how that collapsed into becoming, and the action of becoming basically canceled itself out. Becoming became, what it became was determinate being. Well, here you have the motion from finitude to infinity, and then again you have the motion from infinity back to finitude, and both of those actions are sublated in their motion and make up affirmative infinity, right? And from that point, um, you transition. I keep flipping pages. Sorry, I don't have any of this marked. Um, um, from that, the motion, which is like becoming. Here, let me just read it. Ideality can be called the quality of infinity, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition, like that of becoming a determinate being, which is now to be indicated, which basically he's going to talk about, and then he's going to jump right into being for self as a sublating of finitude, that is, of finitude as such, and equally of the infinity, which is merely its opposite, merely negative. This return into self is self-relation, being. As this being contains negation, it is determinate. But as this negation further is essentially negation of the negation, for this before, negation of negation, it's sort of like, a negative times a negative equals a positive. If you've seen that movie with Edward James Olmos, he's saying that over and over. It's always in my head. Yeah. The self-relating negation is what it is. It is that determinate being which is called being for self, and then you go into the next chapter, he talks about that. But the big thing to highlight here is, if you're confused about how finitude and infinity work as moving parts moving parts of determinate being. Just remember that you can compare them to the oscillation of being and nothing that collapse into the movement of becoming, right? Except what they collapse into as a sublated determination. It's basically affirmative infinity, which is the real infinity, as opposed to the what's that word Alex used a couple days ago, Kyle? The bad infinity. We call it bad infinity, but it's also it's like specious or
Yeah, spurious is what.
yes, yeah, spurious. Thank you. Yeah, so there's a spurious infinity where you add one more number, or well, that's with quantity, but I mean, the same action performs over and over again ad infinitum, and the actual infinity and its movement. I mean, it's basically change and growth within the same determinate being that stays itself, right? We talked about how something another, the other others itself while remaining something. Well, at this level, the determinate being comes more into focus as being for self, with infinity and finitude, each sublated, basically moving into each other. And if you're confused about this, all you really need to know at this point is that with finitude comes a limit. And we can pretty much, I mean, it seems pretty common sense, but when you're looking at infinity and you try to quantify it or qualify it, a limit shows up in it. In other words, it collapses back into finitude, hence the movement back from infinity to finitude. The spurious, what do I want to say? The spurious infinity that you get to, right, within that section, you're thinking about this spurious infinity and its structure, in terms of quality, and you find that the limit, I can't remember exactly how, but a limit shows up and hence finitude itself, something along those lines. So I'm just going to say that's about what I got from this section. Stacks open.
Here's the famous example of the straight line versus the circle. Straight line represents a bad infinity. The circle is a good infinity.
Yeah, exactly. And also this section sort of helps define what he means abstractly early in the text when he talks about how his system of reasoning is a circle and has to be a circle. And you're thinking, okay, well, I'll take that on faith. But I mean, it's the preface, so I kind of have to. But here he kind of defines how the straight line versus the circle represents the bad infinity versus the good. In other words, the good infinity allows you to return to yourself, but with, I don't know, like you've changed, but you're still the same person. Like me, I'm 44, almost 45, right? I used to be 20 years old, right? And I'm the same person. Well, I mean, materially, I'm roughly the same person I was when I was 20, but, I've returned to myself every day, as I grow older, and I'm still the same, but I've also changed. And those two qualities of myself being determinations of myself. It's a little like Cisco, like Cisco sees time as this linear line that he's living, and he doesn't know what the future looks like. Whereas the prophets, I mean, they can see his life as they can see the end of his life, exactly what happens. They never tell him, of course. You'd think they'd be like, what? You're going to be, sublated into the wow, my brain is not working today. The celestial temple in 8 years. Don't you know that, right? Anyway, Stacks. Oh yeah, Kyle. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just saw that.
No, actually, when I was going through this kind of reminds me of a certain series of cardinals, or kind of just sort of like an index of infinities in set theory. So in the sense, you start out with your countable numbers, which is given the initial aleph number, which is what the normally uses aleph null. So of course, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to infinity. But then there's a cardinal above that for another infinity, which includes all the real numbers, all the rational numbers, irrationals, etc. is aleph 1, and then it shows kind of a aleph 2, aleph 3, etc. must exist through that process. And in going through this, it did make me kind of go back and think that just is the spiritless infinity kind of that you're seeing there, because after all, the aleph null, it being countable numbers, itself seems in fact to be incomplete or finite in comparison to the next set of numbers, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's kind of cool.
So how do you bring then that back around to the concept of infinity in a circle?
Well, here's the thing.
Open, close.
Well, yeah, and here's the thing. I have to keep reminding myself, and I especially did on Saturday when we were talking with Alex. We got a certain point into the discussion of infinity, and I was like, wait a minute, we have not broken into quantity yet or measure. None of that. There are no numbers. It's just being. It's just existing. And how do you exist? And what's the nature of your existence with these determinations? And if they include finitude and infinity, and they don't reference numbers like directly in the logical argument, how does that play out qualitatively? And that's not a question we ask ourselves very often at all. It's quite interesting. Like, how does this concept work without the numbers? Stacks open. Any questions about I don't know, to read out the categories, but I don't want to sound like an ass.
I don't know exactly how infinity in reaching beyond itself comes back to finite. Is it the kind of concept there we find that it's incomplete, or?
Well, the spurious infinity, in being what it is, unfortunately develops a limit within it. And that's a contradiction to the concept of infinity as as immediate, right? And that limitation kicks it back into finitude. Now I don't know what page it's on. I need to find it. Crap, the infinite in general is the negation of the negation, affirmation being which has restored itself out of limitedness. The infinite is, and more intensely so, than the first immediate being. It is the true being, the elevation above limitation. I could wade through his text, or I could just open it up straight to the EL and see if. Okay. This infinity is spurious or negative infinity, since it is nothing but the negation of the finite. But the finite arises again in the same way, so that it is no more sublated than not. In other words, this infinity expresses only the requirement that the finite ought to be sublated. This progress ad infinitum does not go beyond the expression of the contradiction which the finite contains, i.e., that it is just as much something as its other, And this progress is the perpetual continuation of the alternation between these determinations, each bringing in the other one. Yeah, the problem of the finite and the infinity is basically where Kant and Fichte go off the rails in their own philosophy. They, it says on page 150 of the EL, it says, the infinity of reflection discussed here is merely the attempt to attain true infinity. It is a wretched intermediate thing. Generally speaking, this is the philosophical standpoint that has recently prevailed in Germany. In this view, the finite only ought to be sublated, and the infinite ought not to be merely something negative, but something positive as well. This ought always implies impotence, the fact that something is recognized as justified and yet can never make itself prevail. With regard to the ethical domain, the Kantian and the Fichtean philosophies got stuck at this standpoint of the ought. Perpetual approximation to the law of reason is the utmost that can be attained on this path. And even the immortality of the soul has been based on this postulate. So he's basically saying, we got it, Kant and Fichte, they got it close enough for government work, but did they actually show a real proof? Hell no, they didn't. And that's part of Hegel's problem with them.
I think it's related to Hegel's problem with the Kant's dualism between the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. So the noumenal realm would be where the infinite resides. The phenomenal realm would be where the finite resides. But
Yeah.
Hegel doesn't like that. Hegel very much objects to those kinds of dualisms.
Yeah. And you notice this keeps coming up with a lot of these categories. It's not just one place on the spiral going up to the absolute that you find the problem with their critique of metaphysics, because it goes off the rail on so many points on the DNA strand that, it's not like you could just fix one strand and it's all great. No, it's riddled with cancer, as it were. The philosophies of Kant and Fichte are riddled with these contradictions that arise because they insist on the understanding, in other words, the opposition of seemingly opposite categories, among other things. And that's what kills that's what kills their philosophy and makes it stand in neutral. And yes, the earlier the category in Hegel's system, their problems show up. It doesn't matter because they skate past it by, well, Kant anyway, by listing out the categories of the judgment. Is that right? The metaphysical categories, and they try to critique it, as if they could do it all the way across the board rather than derive them properly. So they pretend there's not a problem and they go on because it's the next one on the list. Whereas if the process stalled with Hegel, he would not be able to continue. Like, he wouldn't be able to continue the list. You know what I mean? The way that he did it. With them, they just read off the next one on the list. Stacks open.
Yes, kind of one of the points that also seems interesting came up where the spurious infinity, like the straight line itself, like to infinity in both directions, itself is kind of it's termed like to be an unreal infinity, right? And yet the one that loops back on itself makes more sense to actually, be real, as in like, actuality in a way. Which I don't know, that might come up a lot more in nature and stuff, but just trying to think about how that applies to how I've been thinking about, the universe itself is basically flat. So in a way, it seems like a line can go on forever, but maybe there's an underlying reason that loops back upon itself, kind of thing.
The big thing to remember is with the spurious
Yeah.
infinity, something becomes another, and the other becomes another, and the other becomes another, and you can see this qualitative on and on and on and on and on, syntax error, in DOS 3.1, whereas the actual infinity is basically the process of something becoming other and becoming another and another and another, but the something is still a something, right?
Right.
Qualitatively, it's the process of change, of growth, right? You plant a seed and it turns into a tree. The tree, it came from the seed, materially, right? And instead of thinking of it as an abstract, and these are abstract categories, right? But the shape of the movement you're supposed to think of is not just the unending line, but the person who lived for 99 years and had the same name, and on that line, lived on that line, but was still the person, right? Or the tree, right? 1,000 years passed and the seed became a tree, which became an oak, and whatever, it's still the same oak. And that's qualitatively the shape you're supposed to think of. But the way that he describes it is strictly categorical. And he does give examples, which, I mean, he does, including a plant, to illustrate it. I don't remember exactly where it was. I think I read it out last time. I really like the various commentaries that he has in the Science of Logic on this stuff, but I'm beginning to see how people bang their head against the wall, because the oscillation of being and nothing, and their action implying becoming, it's pretty easy to understand. It's within half a page, 1 page. His description of infinity collapsing into finitude, and finitude being negated by infinity, that at first the immediate spurious infinity. It's not easy, and it's a couple pages long, and you have to hang with him. But if you hang with him to the end, or like draw it or something, then you see it. And as long as you keep in mind that it's like the oscillation from the earlier strand down the spiral, then you kind of get it. Is that clear as mud?
Well, it's clearer than it was.
Yeah. And I imagine there's stuff about this argument that we're just not going to get until we get to later categories, and they mirror the earlier one, and we're like, oh, because the later category is more concrete, and we'll be like, yeah, I can see how that works. And then he'll reference this one, right? And then we go back and be like, okay, that's like this, only with less determinations interacting, or however you put that. I'm kind of interested as to why he broke out being for self in its own chapter, chapter 3, and that, I mean, that ends quality, but he's still talking about determinate being, right? He hasn't ended the saga of determinate being with affirmative infinity. He goes on to being for itself, And that lasts what, like 3 pages in the EL. And then you graduate to quantity through what the hell was it? With the one and the many. And that's a whole discussion in and of itself. I found it funny because on Saturday, Alex tried to sort of collapse the discussion of something and other with the one and the many. And I'm like, that doesn't exactly work. Like the one and the many, like something is a very determinate, qualitative determinate being, right? Whereas the one, you can't really parallel them because the one isn't really anything. It's like negation with legs, right? And the point is that through repulsion, and we haven't got there. I'm just saying this out loud really quick. You know what I'm talking about, Kyle. Through repulsion, many are born, and the many, each of them have a affirmative determinate being, right? Whereas the one did not, right? And part of the point is that you can't just have one, right? It's an abstract concept that collapses. And through repulsion, you see the many. And then the many, through attraction, which is the opposite movement, collapse into an actual, like real one, right? That is determinate and affirmative. And that's where the wheels kind of come off for me. What is it? But the many are each one what the other is. Each of them is one or also one of the many. They are, God, this sounds like a religious catechism, for Christ's sake. They are therefore one and the same, or when the repulsion is considered in itself then as the negative behavior of the many ones against each other, it is just as essentially their relation to each other. And since those to which the one relates itself in its repelling are ones, in relating to them, it relates itself to itself. Thus, repulsion is just as essentially attraction, and the excluding one or being for self sublates itself. Qualitative determinacy, which is the one, which in the one has reached its determinateness in and for itself, has thus passed over into determinacy as sublated, i.e., into being as quantity. And that's the end of the chapter. We haven't talked about yet, right? But you can see the movement, right? And in each one, and it almost runs parallel. I mean, this is the dialectic, the turnover from freedom to terror in the phenomenology is the same sort of meat, I guess you could say, of dialectical movement as this, right? If you see repulsion and attraction and how they turn over into each other, they don't just do it because they feel like it. They do it because because the abstract one becomes the real many, and the real many become the real one through those processes. And he explains it all, especially in the additions and the comments, I think. But anyway, back to it. We're just at affirmative infinity, the real infinity, which is something that changes but stays itself, right? And from there, there's the transition. How do we get to the transition from there? Do you remember, Kyle?
Well, not very well. But yeah, I know he was comparing it to becoming.
Yeah.
Sublating the finite ideality can be called the quality of infinity, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition like that of becoming and determinate being, which is now to be indicated as a sublating of finitude, that is, of finitude as such, and equally of the infinity, which is merely its opposite, merely negative. This return into self is self-relation being. And this being contains negation in its determinant, But as this negation further is essentially negation of the negation, the self-related negation, which that's pretty much what every sublation is at this point. It is that determinate being, which is called being for itself.
On the page earlier, I think he gets to what I'm trying to tease
Yeah.
out. On 149, he says, true infinity taken thus generally as determinate being, which is posited as affirmative, in contrast to the abstract negation, is reality in a higher sense than the former reality, which was simply determinate. For here, it has acquired a concrete content. So reality earlier, affirmative infinity is basically its parallel higher on the spiral is what I'm trying to say. Um, it is not the finite, which is the real, but the infinite. Thus, reality is further determined as essence, notion, idea, and so on. It is, however, superfluous to repeat an earlier, more abstract category such as reality in connection with the more concrete categories, and to employ it for determinations which are more concrete than it is in its own self. Duh. Such repetition as to say that essence or the idea is the real has its origin in the fact that for untrained thinking, the most abstract categories such as being, determinate being, reality, finitude are the most familiar. So you'll see, like in common speech, reality applied to all manner of shapes, whether it's appropriate or not, just to get like the sense of what that means. But we only use one word. For Hegel, he can't use just the one word over and over because he's actually dealing with the derived categories, and they have to match up in their what do you call it, in their exactitude of determinations, right? And more on that in just a second. So he says the more precise reason for recalling the category of reality here is that the negation to which it is opposed as the affirmative is here negation of the negation. As such, it is itself opposed to that reality which finite determinate being is. The negation is thus determined as ideality, ideal being, and it's thus ideal, ideala, as opposed to ideala, which is a different, it's a different word, right? And the one he's using, he's very specific. Down here, he's like he says, das ideala has a more precise meaning of the beautiful and its associations than das ideala. The former is not yet appropriate here, and for this reason, we've used the expression ideal. We do not make this distinction, though, when speaking of reality. You know, and he's breaking it out because common language, which is the story, which is the medium he's trying to tell this through, often has homonyms, and he wants to make sure like he's using the right one. Hang on. What else does he say? He says the negation is thus determined as ideality. Ideal being is the finite as it is in the true infinite as a determination, a content which is distinct but is not an independent self-subsistent being, but only a moment. Ideality has this more concrete signification, which is not fully expressed by the negation of finite determinate being. With reference to reality and ideality, however, the opposite of finite and infinite is grasped in such a manner that the finite ranks as the real, but the infinite as the ideal. In the same way that further on, the notion too is regarded as an ideal, that is, as a mere ideal, in contrast to determinate being as such, which is regarded as the real. When they are contrasted in this way, it is pointless to reserve the term ideal for the concrete determination of negation in question. In that opposition, we return once again to the one-sidedness of the abstract. Basically, he's saying, once again, that none of these categories, even ideality, can be taken concretely by itself without reference to, you know, its opposite, because they're continuous. There's no line in between them, remember. And so there's no hard and fast definition for any of these because they all well, not all. Most of the big ones overturn into their opposite if their structure demands it. Not all of them do, right? There are a whole bunch of intermediate ones that don't because that's just the way it is. If you're looking for a system whereby every category turns over into its opposite, that's not how it works. You can't overlay a template and say this is what's always going to happen, because it's not always what happens, right? Some of them are just singular, but contain pairs. Like becoming contains the pair of being a nothing, but becoming does not have a counterpart, an opposite, right? It is still a hard category. In fact, it's the first concrete category, and he says it a couple times in both books, but it's by itself. But at the same time, it's not, because it contains the two moments. And in that, it contains a single movement. Now it's still a double, being into nothing, nothing into being. Whereas in infinity, is it infinity? No, ideality. Ideality is the sublated determination that contains finitude and infinity, infinitude, double oscillating, right? And because it's like becoming, ideality is not going to have a counterpart at its same level. You could sort of talk about the ideal and the real, but to talk of the real is to go the wrong way, back down the spiral, right? It's that's not how it works, right? So the ideal, like becoming, collapses into being for self, because that manifold of movement is basically self, the self relation, the self reference, right? The being is self referential, as you like. And if you asked me if I understood that before I got here tonight and tried to like talk about it right here, I'll honestly tell you I had a flatter understanding of it. Now saying it out loud, it's a little more concrete, but all of these are still really abstract categories, just in the logical argument itself. If that makes any sense. What I'm finding is that a lot of the sort of insight about this process and what you can say about it is far more interesting than going through the process and being like, see how it moves here and moves there, right? It almost seems mundane when you describe it, but then you sort of abstract it and are able to describe it in, I don't know, qualitative terms. I'm trying to think of what I'm talking about here. I'm not even sure I can say it right now. Stacks open. Kyle, I kind of saw Alex perk up after I related the end. I mean the determinations of determinate being at the end of quality with Alex to Marx's Capital, and sort of why there's an obvious quantity involved in the commodity, but there's also a hidden quantity that you never think of. And he perked up and he's like, yeah, that's my bread and butter for like 50 years or however long he's been alive, right? And so he's like, oh yeah, I know that. He like rattles it off like nothing. So obviously, and Marx says it straight in chapter 1. You can count commodities all day long, but this is not a history of commercial dealing. This is we're trying to figure out what the commodity consists of qualitatively. And one of the qualitative aspects is that it's defined qualitatively by the quantitative and hidden nature of the hours put into it, the commodity that defines its value, the socially necessary labor time. You count the hours and they equal a homogeneous quality that's imbued on the commodity, which you can't see, can't hear, can't smell, but you can, put in your logbook as, okay, this commodity is $50, right? But if it didn't have the price tag, which people are obliged to put on it, you wouldn't know that it's actually $50 on the market. You have to reference the market in order to figure out how it's a commodity, right? That makes sense. So there's not only, the actual material object, there's the social system that it exists in. But if there wasn't any reference to the social system, it couldn't be a commodity. Anyway. But yeah, there are hidden determinations at each of the levels in the logic based on their appearance, which is why the former metaphysics always drew a line between opposites. Even our language grew up. Even our language, let me say that again. Even our language evolved the way it did because it's obvious that usually in common speech we see the ideal and the real not as continuous determinations as they really are, but in their appearance as opposites. And then they're deposited in the language like that. And it's such a strong pull that even Kant, who wanted to criticize the categories because obviously the metaphysics was not working, the former metaphysics, even the rationalist stuff, that he was unable to untie that knot. Hegel was, or at least I think he was. I'm beginning to see what his criticism of Spinoza is, and I have not read Spinoza, but what he basically says is that Spinoza draws the same line between being and nothing and says that where there's one, there's not the other. Whereas Hegel says being and nothing are basically the same. They collapse into each other and become, and so on and so on. Whereas in Spinoza, he pretty explicitly says that they exclude each other. Something along those lines. Stack's open. Fun stuff, huh, guys? You guys aren't getting bored with this yet, are you?
I think I'm getting reinvigorated into it, actually.
Yeah. Today I started reading Hulgate's new book. I'm on like page 21 of Hegel on Being, the double volume commentary on the doctrine of being. And I'm already into the chapter on the critique of Kant. And I'm having a lot of trouble with the one and the many. Like I think I get the movement in the basic description, but I can't see it as well yet as I see finitude and infinity. It's going to take me a couple read throughs to like really get it, because with the one and the many and the completion and sublation into quantity in its immediacy, what you have is the full roster of interacting determinations that make up quality. What is quality, right? It's quality, quantity, and measure, and that's all of being. So once you get to the end of quality, basically what something is, then you move into quantity, and I can't characterize it yet. I haven't read that far. Anyone have any, I don't know. Doug, have you read up through where we were reading?
Yeah, I've read it.
Okay.
I don't think I understood it very well. That's why I've been mostly quiet.
No, that's okay. I just wondered. Yeah. To be honest with you guys, I have been stuck on chapter 2 for like a year and a half. So don't feel bad. Like where I am, like half of it was listening to Alex drone on for these couple past Saturdays, as well as just rereading it through and reading the commentary and trying to be like, okay, what's going on here? It's not easy. And even having gone through the entire Encyclopedia Logic, it's still not easy, especially at these early stages, which is surprising to me because, like the phenomenology, I actually found the first couple of chapters pretty easy once I figured out what was going on. But like later, when he starts getting into like freedom and terror and all of that stuff, some of the determinations he loses me, and I'm going to have to reread it again. But I find that every time I think of just stopping and being like, okay, I got the gist, I get to a part that I find really parallels some of what Marx does with the commodity various points. I mean, not just at the beginning, but like with the circuits of capital, and how all of that works in volume 2. And I get reinvigorated. I'm like, okay, all right, we're actually like making good connections here. There was an article, I shared this with you, Doug, on the thing. There was an article that just came out, brand spanking new on the press, from Historical Materialism. And it's called, shit, I can't remember the name of it. Let's see, it's advanced art. It's in the advanced articles section. It's called The Logic Question, Marx, Trendelenburg, and the Critique of Hegel. And the author pours through Marx's early stuff and makes the claim that Marx was quite a bit more aware of the logic than most people give him credit for. Like there's the standard interpretation, and the standard interpretation where the early Marx was only sort of familiar and only references the phenomenology and the philosophy of right. And the author here says that part of the reason that we think that is because David Ryazanov organized the narrative that way based on the materials he had, which was not the complete picture, unfortunately. I just sort of thought that was interesting because part of the reason that he engaged with this guy Trendelenburg in the first place was Trendelenburg was like the preeminent scholar who was sorry, my brain again is starting to trail. He was the preeminent author in the age just prior to Marx, responsible for demoting Hegel's system to, the dead dog status. And Hegel had worked up, I'm guessing, some sort of refutation of Trendelenburg, although if he actually did, it doesn't survive. And it calls to the author does not say this, but it makes me wonder if Ryazanov found it and trashed it because it didn't fit in with the narrative that Engels popularized and was sort of like borne out in the Second International. I'll have to read the whole article. I only read the abstract and the introduction, but it was kind of interesting to think of Marx far more familiar with the logic and dialectical movement of the categories than is often given credit in his mature works. So not only was there no break, but he knew what was going on from the beginning before making his partnership with Engels. I mean, considering he was a student of Hegel, I could well believe it, because why would you just, especially in his era, why would you just conform to just the phenomenology and the critique not the critique, but the philosophy of right alone, right? Anyway, I'll have to finish the article.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I've already linked it too.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a piece from an academic Marxist. So keep that in mind also, because he sort of puts part of the accountability on Engels for popularizing some aspects of Marx's work rather than others. And I'm always kind of wary of those because they often end up demoting Engels. But as I read further into the introduction, it didn't seem that way so much. It was just sort of like Engels tends to summarize, right? In a lot of his work. That's what it was. It was Ludwig Feuerbach, his book, Engels' book, and how he sort of draws a line between, I think this is the same paper. Engels, I'm going to have to read the book because I can't reference it for sure, but I think the claim is made that Engels draws a line between materialism and idealism in the book. Whereas Marx never really does in his work. And if you read Capital, you can see the line disappears entirely because the commodity itself is a pretty universal term that can be applied to concrete objects, but doesn't have to be, like in discussion, like as an idea shape and so on and so forth. I don't know. Engels is also really quite clear that he is not like the brains of the philosophical operation the way Marx is. Like he comes out and says it. And anyway, I'm getting crickets here, guys. So I'm gonna.
Yeah.
I'm not complaining. It's all good, but I do want to go ahead and assign the next reading, because then we can show up and we don't have to talk about this section anymore unless it comes up later. But I wanted to go ahead and assign from the beginning of Being for Self, which is page 157. Okay, and we're going to read through page 164. Okay, just read through, read to B. Okay, on page 164 it says the one and the many, so just stop at the top of the page 164 and you got it, and then we'll talk about that next time. And I know I'm keeping it rather short, but at the same time, there's only so much of this we can digest as a group without just overwhelming ourselves. And I realized last time something. This group from here on out is basically going to be like our Capital group, where we read, the set number of pages. We show up. We, if someone has a lead off, you're welcome to. But if you don't, or none of us do, we can just sit there and discuss a couple questions about it and just leave it at that, and then go on to the next reading. Because at this point, without a lot of study, I can't be a teacher on these things past this point, because the one and the many is where my understanding of like all of it sort of falls off the wagon. Until I read the Holgate's commentary, I'm not going to understand everything about it, but that's okay.
Just had a thought. Since this is about to be Thanksgiving, I'm assuming we're gonna meet. Good to meet next Monday, but not the one after. Okay.
Yeah, next Monday.
The 20th. The 27th is going to be right after Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah, you guys want to take the 27th off? I'm good with that. And yeah, and it'll probably give us a needed break to like catch up on reading the stuff if we haven't read all the way through, or just understanding what's going on. And we haven't really taken a break since this began, so that's not a bad notion. Yeah. All right, it's 10 o'clock. I'm just gonna say have a great night, comrades, and